discussion about responsible AI. Later on, I will be introducing our speakers. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about our meetup. We have events, regular events in different locations about different things. Mostly our events are dedicated to machine learning, data science, AI, and anything connected with AI. We recently started launching our events in the US, and we have several groups on meetup.com. We have a group in Boston, and we're doing events in Boston. We have Washington, D.C., and it's our first event for this location. And we also have Austin, Texas. If you would like, you can scan the QR code and join our group on meetup.com. We also have a group on LinkedIn, and I'll be sharing that too. So let's get to our agenda for today. We have a talk. Our first talk will be by Rachel from Microsoft, and she will be talking about AI, responsible AI in general, and she will be covering different methodologies and different approaches and sharing some best practices that they accumulated at Microsoft. Rachel will be joining us tonight virtually. I hope everything goes well with this virtual presentation. And then we'll have a talk by Bilva on trust and safety aspects of AI-generated content, such as images. Then we'll have a short break. We can just enjoy some food and drinks, and then sit down for another 20-30 minutes for a panel discussion, and just ask questions. First, maybe let the speakers share their opinions on some questions that we have from our moderator. The discussion will be moderated by my colleague Rosmi. Yeah, she's in the audience. And then we'll have some time for the questions from the audience. So I think that's it. And we can go directly to Rachel's presentation. So let me move. Yeah, Rachel, are you here with us? Oh, just a moment. Let me put you here. Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Just a moment. Is it too big or is it okay? No, I think that's fine. You can see Rachel and the presentation both. Yeah. Okay. Rachel, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Azafrani. I am an AI ethicist. I'm the co-chair of the IEEE research group on autonomy and weapons systems. I'm a senior program manager in the Office of Responsible AI, and I'm also a consultant to the U.S. Army Science Board on AI and national security issues. And I'm here to give you a brief overview of AI governance, why it's important, why it's increasingly relevant to organizations of all shapes and sizes, and really what it means in this new era of AI that we have. If you could go to the next slide, please. So first I'll be talking about AI governance, and then I'll be talking about some approaches to AI governance that are quite different and that could be applied to many different contexts in your organizations. Let's see. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So AI governance, is it really important, to companies of all industries and sizes? And the answer is executives increasingly think so. And there was a study that Capgemini had first begun to release in 2019 that started to survey CEOs of companies, asking them whether ethical issues in AI applications was something that they encountered in their business. And you can start to see that across the world, this is not an isolated problem, that executives kind of agreed that AI ethics was an issue that they were facing as far as risk management in a number of different dimensions. We're not just talking about developing AI, but we're also talking about using AI here. So you can notice that increasingly, we have executives who are concerned about this issue and countries that are concerned about this issue. We also saw a vast publication of AI ethics strategies at the national level, and we now have a collection of over 100 of those. The OECD monitors them. And all in all, it seems like the world is progressing and moving toward a framework of AI governance, but what does that actually mean when we apply it, to our everyday work and with our teams? So if you could go to the next slide, please. So what is governance to begin with? There are two contexts that we speak of when we talk about governance. One is a business context. In general, when we talk about governance in a business setting, we mean that we are meeting the needs of our stakeholders, whether that's our shareholders, whether that's our executives, whether that's our coworkers, that we are ensuring that an organization is running smoothly and in compliance enough to function. And so this means we have to balance different objectives to achieve goals as an organization. So that's sort of on a very broad level what governance means. In a public policy setting, when we talk about governance, we talk about laws, we talk about regulation, norms, and standards that are actually clarifying and informing how businesses go about their objectives. And so when we apply this to AI, what this means is acceptable and appropriate uses of AI and a way that a business can effectively monitor that that's taking place over time. So if you could advance the next slide, please. And I think it's really important that we realize that AI governance is a relatively new field. There is a vast complexity underpinning the issues that we're talking about here that have been treated in many other areas of compliance in general, such as privacy, such as security. And so we need to kind of take a holistic view of what has already been done, because as we will go through this presentation, we can actually see that a lot of the things that we've learned and mistakes that we've made over time are highly relevant to AI governance and ensuring that it's developed and used in a way that benefits both our organizations and also more broadly the people that we are producing technology for. Next slide, please. And so why does AI need governance in the first place? So this slide has a few tiles that kind of explains that'll appear as you kind of click through them. Perfect, that's it. So why AI needs governance in the first place? When we are looking at issues of software and issues of AI and how fundamentally, what is the pivot that has been made that makes AI so unique to need its own governance structure? I think what I think of is this question that for the first time in human history, we have a decision maker about human life, about resources that is actually not human, and how and under what framework are those decisions governed? That to me is why AI needs governance. This slide illustrates a whole set of sort of the paradigmatic ethical issues that we have in AI. We have autonomy, which I think speaks to what I was just saying, is that we have a decision maker that is not a human. And so how are those decisions being made and imbued in technology? We've got privacy issues that are increasingly important, because now we're not just talking about personally identifiable information, we're talking about systems that are able to correlate very disparate pieces of information and triangulate that to a person. So we have different issues in privacy because of AI. We have explainability issues, human AI interaction, making sure that, because we have an interface now between humans and computers that we haven't before, making sure that that is something that the humans and computers are both kind of optimizing each other's abilities. We have longer term societal issues such as job loss and de-skilling. And we have broader issues of, once we start to get AI to a level, which we already have in many skill sets, past the point where humans can perform, how do we want to think about how those technologies are governed and where they apply? Because they could have pretty broad-reaching implications for society. So all in all, these are the set of issues that make AI unique to other software issues. Next slide, please. So now that we've kind of gotten a grasp on the issues of AI governance, I'm going to go through some frameworks that are publicly available that demonstrate how AI governance can be achieved even when an organization, whether or not an organization is actually developing an AI technology or whether it's applying it, whether it's applied in a recruitment function, actually at the application level for the product that you're building. AI governance actually applies to this whole range of AI lifecycle issues. So I'll go ahead and start to introduce some of the most popular frameworks that we have right now. Next slide, please. And next one. So in order to apply some of these governance frameworks, you actually have to do a little bit of an intake with your organization and understand, okay, where is AI actually coming into play, and is AI coming into play at all in a way that's actually bringing in some of these ethical issues or risk. And one lesson that we can draw here is from cybersecurity, in that when we're thinking about, and essentially indexing all of the areas where AI comes into play and thinking, how does that pose a risk to my business? What is the likelihood that that risk is actually going to come into being? That can help us prioritize, because this is such a new field, because resources are so scarce, expertise is so scarce, we really need a way to triage, and that's very important. So what's relevant for Microsoft is not going to be necessarily relevant to any other organization, even though Microsoft has shared, a bunch of public materials about how we do this for the sake of transparency, but they're not necessarily going to be able to be picked up off the shelf and just used by any other business. Next slide, please. This one's got some more tiles here. That's perfect. That's it. So when we think about AI risk, I think there are a couple of dimensions and ways to start to go about how to even create that index in the first place. And it's not just to do with the technology itself. That's very important. You need to understand where risk enters into the program. Is it because people aren't sure how to use the system? So then we're talking about a transparency issue, not necessarily an engineering issue. Is it a sort of culture of business is resulting in a way that AI is applied in a way that maybe could have more safeguards or could be made more safely? All of these factors are both technical and non-technical, and this is very important to consider when you're building that picture of AI risk, and that you're not just indexing for, this is where I am developing or deploying AI in my business. How are you thinking about your people, where you're getting the AI from, and your culture as a business? Next slide, please. So another kind of risk management framework that's helpful once you've started to identify these risks, you can start to go through in cybersecurity what we call this feedback loop of risk management, where we have identified the risks. Now we're assessing them. We're doing something about them. So this is where it really comes into the indexing and thinking about where actually is AI being used or developed or deployed. Again, not everything is going to be relevant to everyone here. And then making sure that this is an ongoing cycle. There's another example of this on the next slide, actually, in a more applied setting. So NIST really recently released its AI risk management framework. And there they had 4 steps actually. So the first one would be to measure and understand where risk comes in, to manage it, continue to map out how those mitigations are meeting that risk, and then creating a governance framework that will enable you to do that over time. So this is where that broader institutional view to AI governance comes in, is because once you have these processes, they can't just be something that happens once. It has to happen over time, and something that, leadership as a whole should probably and has to be bought into in order to make this effective, because it is another element of risk management, like cybersecurity, like privacy, that's going to become increasingly important and needs to be tracked over time. Next slide, please. here's another example of what that looks like. This one is actually Microsoft's model. So in the middle, you have our AI principles and how over time we've come to understand, again, where AI fits in our business. It's in a lot of our products. We're creating consumer-facing products. We need to constantly understand how those products are being used by consumers, whether they're safe. We need to develop models of that risk, and then we actually need to give our engineering teams resources to mitigate that risk. So this is what it looks like when you have that consumer-facing model, but you can imagine that this is because Microsoft is dealing with the entire AI lifecycle from start to finish. If you have, for example, if you're a supplier of data, you can assess where you are in the AI development pipeline, take pieces of these frameworks, and then apply them where it's most relevant to you. So some high-level objectives of a responsible AI strategy or AI governance strategy to help ground it and frame it in something more concrete. What is the ultimate goal of doing this in the first place is that we want to create responsible technology, number one. Number two, we want other people to use this technology in a way that's rights respecting. And then three, we actually want the technology to benefit people. We want to create trust in AI. And AI governance actually creates a layer of trust in the technology that can help people apply it to solve problems. So it's a really it's a good positive feedback cycle that actually helps with AI adoption as well. Next slide. So here are just a couple summary slide of AI risk management frameworks that are available. And the reason why I left this others one open is I hope that during the discussion, you all will share some others that you've seen. NIST is one of the most recent ones. IEEE has one as well. There are other existing standards that apply too. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts about this. Next slide. Here's an example of what I mean by when I say that existing technology standards already apply to AI, that we're not doing something entirely new here, that ethics in technology is not a new field. And so this is an example of how NIST has taken some categories of standards that it has had, for example, in the legal and regulatory domain or the analytical and research domain. And they've mapped, NIST has done the job of mapping to say, why this is relevant to AI already, how you should apply them, and then actually the risk that these existing standards mitigate. So it's worth mentioning and noting that we don't need entirely new frameworks to start doing this today. Next slide. And of course, to enable all this to happen in the first place, we need to give tools and resources at the engineering level. And here are just, again, a few examples of some that are available. There's the Microsoft Responsible AI Toolbox, Google's What If, IBM's AI Fairness, data sheets for data sets, and other standardization activity that are outlining and detailing how to build AI risk management tools and monitoring. And so, again, I'd love to come back to that in the discussion. If you have any other resources that you felt helpful as you are developing AI systems. Next, please. Here's another way to look at it, which I think tends to be really helpful, especially when you think about the end-to-end development of a product, or even if you're only involved in a certain segment of AI development, which part of the AI lifecycle are you in? Understanding which stakeholders are involved in that aspect of the cycle, and then asking questions relevant to the risk in that particular area. So we see that in this framework, this is an example that McKinsey made. We have data sourcing, model development, and monitoring and maintenance as actually pretty distinct phases that have different stakeholders involved and different levels of questions and management that are necessary to mitigate risk and where risk enters at each step of the way. Next, please. So some final thoughts that I have on this subject are that we, in the name of the public interest, need more AI regulation, and it is coming, but because these are effects on society, we can't really rely on private sector sources to maintain public interest in that same way. So we really do need government to take action here in order to make sure that norms and ethical standards are applied consistently across technology companies and across society. And there are a couple hurdles that we have to that, some structural challenges into getting more AI regulation in place right now. One would be, a lot of expertise lies in the private sector. So it's great to have these kinds of dialogues to make sure, we're actually sharing information. Second one, we're still trying to decide on what the best way is. So we don't really have a normative consensus right now. And third, there is sort of a mismatch we are seeing between this push for innovation and, push for regulation, and trying to reconcile those two things in a way that can advance innovation, but in a measured and thoughtful way. But all in all, laws and norms and standards are going to be absolutely critical for responsible AI, and industry is not going to be able to tackle this by itself. Next slide, please. So final closing thoughts here. AI governance is going to be an entirely unique exercise to every organization. There are tools and frameworks that exist for both development and use of AI, and it's very important to consider where you are upstream or downstream in the AI lifecycle for employing these existing frameworks, because not all of them are going to be relevant, and it's going to be a learning journey. So it's really important that we we share our experiences in forums like this. And with that, that is the conclusion of this presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for this great presentation. And I believe we might have some questions in the Zoom chat. Let me check. And do we have any questions here? Anything to discuss with Rachel? Please let me know while I'll check the Zoom, okay? No, it appears that we don't have any questions in the... Okay.
How long do I need to wait? Can you hear me?
Rachel, can you... no?
Let's see, Amina, if you could
Yeah,
repeat what he says after, that would be great. Yeah.
Or maybe I will just give a microphone to you. Yes.
I can hear that works.
Can you hear now?
Let's see, I can hear you, Amina, perfect. I don't think I can hear what he's saying.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, that's the goal. So first, a great presentation, I think. One of the questions that I think that a couple of people have struggled with in the policy space, in particular, is defining actions versus defining outcomes. Like, I wonder what your take is on that. Like, especially as when you said that for regulation is needed, whatever one may think of that, but like, what that regulation takes form of, whether it's outcome oriented or action oriented. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Got it. That's a really important question. So I think if I could, just to make sure that I summarize here, the maybe sometimes tension or prioritization of actions versus outcomes when we're thinking about risk management. So I think, especially because, so I'm thinking right now, thinking from the perspective of an organization that is producing many, many different kinds of technology that is coming into contact with many different kinds of AI models, it can be really difficult, honestly, to generalize action-oriented frameworks. I have definitely seen that myself. And so, but at the same time, sometimes outcomes are a little bit too far-fetched, or they're a little bit too abstract, because you can say, okay, I want this to happen, but then you really need to inform your people how. So I do think that it's a pretty effective approach to start with outcomes. Actually, in fact, I think that starting with something like a set of AI ethics principles is pretty in line with starting with an outcomes-oriented approach. What is the sort of level of beneficence that you're looking to achieve, or the good or the outcome that you're looking to achieve. And then from there, recognizing that we cannot be so prescriptive about the actions in many cases, because the technology is constantly changing, even the way certain models are trained. For example, we have different methods to train generative models. We can't simply say that AI training data needs to look a certain way when you're using a generative adversarial network versus a transformer. Those two things are not the same. You're not the same method. So the methods don't really apply. I do think it's important to start with outcomes. And I think that we can't etch in stone actions too quickly, but actions can be mapped pretty easily back into outcomes. And if we have that set of principles, we can ground ourselves.
Thank you. That makes sense. I guess if you look at, say, why Congress asked them to come up with the AI risk management framework, it grounds in the success of the cybersecurity RMF. Mm-hmm. The reason why the cybersecurity RMF was so successful is because of its wide adoption, where it was not telling actors what to do, but like what goals they should hope to achieve. So I wonder, like, if there are lessons you think, like, I guess, like, the cybersecurity has been pretty old, but they are updating it again. But I wonder if you think there are lessons that we need to take from when the cybersecurity RMF first came out, which was like 10 years ago, actually. And the technological change that has happened since then, maybe, do you think things need to move in a different, like, North Star, rather than thinking of, because that was successful 10 years ago, maybe that goes towards.
I see the parallels between cybersecurity and AI. I don't see it as a one-to-one, actually. I see there's a subset of AI ethics issues that are security issues, that are cybersecurity issues. And so in that sense, we can kind of directly transfer some of the threat models and the experience that we have from cybersecurity over. But to your point, when we think about, cybersecurity and certain things, leaving it up to an organization what to do or not to do, in some sense, that depends on the threat model that you're using. You're thinking about, who is the adversary in that situation? When does that adversary come into play? There are adversaries in AI, but in AI, you also have fundamental rights. And I think that that's the difference. In cybersecurity, we have fundamental rights to an extent with privacy. But to me, the difference in that, we can't leave it entirely up to organizations is because we are actually dealing with human rights. And there are a pretty certain set of concrete, rights and decisions about people that need to be upheld legally and from a rights standpoint. So I think it's going to be a balance, and there are definitely lessons that we can draw from cybersecurity, like the fact that we need ongoing monitoring and evaluation. We can draw risk assessment from cybersecurity as well, but I do think that the threat model, so to speak, is a little bit different with AI.
Rachel, I think we have one more question in the Zoom chat. Can you see it?
Yeah, from Arash.
Yeah, could you possibly read it out loud and so that we all hear the question?
Got it. Yes. So there seems to be some alignment on the relevant responsible AI principles across industries such as fairness, transparency, accountability, et cetera. In that case, why do you think that the governance framework and process needs to be different across companies? And I think the main reason for that, from my point of view, and what I was thinking when I was framing this presentation, is that we have entities that are going to be procuring AI systems that have already been built. And then we're going to have entities that are involved at different points of the life cycle. And so an organization's governance process, if we're talking about, okay, I need to build a whole monitoring infrastructure to make sure my engineering teams are building AI in a way that's upholding our principles, that's a different exercise than essentially saying, okay, I need to procure an AI system, say for logistics, how do I do an audit, an ethics audit, quote unquote, of that system? To me, those are, two different framings and exercises. And I think that there's enough differentiation between development and use of AI and different points in the AI lifecycle that it's going to be highly organizationally dependent.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel, for such a great presentation, and thank you for answering the questions. I think that we could move directly to our second presentation. So let me first let me move the slides. Thank you again, Rachel. And now let me thank you. Let me check it here. I think you can just talk.
Whatever
we can ask.
Will the mic be too loud for the?
When we use mic, the sound is really weird for the people who are.
I can just talk then.
Yeah,
That's fine.
yeah, and then we have this clicker here.
Okay.
And it should work. You can. I think this is the perfect spot. Here, and then it should.
I can also press it. I don't mind.
Or sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't for some reason. So what is going on? Yeah,
I got it.
okay. So our next speaker is Bilva, she will be talking about trust and safety aspects of synthetic images and sharing some of her experience and her insights that she gained from her work. And she, I think
I can.
you can go ahead and
Cool. Awesome.
yeah.
Great to see you all tonight. Really happy to talk about this topic. Just to give you some more background about me, I currently work in product safety at OpenAI. Tonight, I will be speaking on behalf of myself, not my employer. So please no OpenAI related questions. But I'm really excited to talk about this. I currently work on safety for DALL-E, and so I've had a lot of time to think about synthetic images and the trust and safety challenges of them. So yeah, I'm really excited. And with that, we can just dive in. Awesome. Okay, so this is the agenda for tonight. I'll be breaking down a few key things before I get into really specific trust and safety risks and acceleration that I really want to deep dive into. But to start off, I really want to talk about kind of what are synthetic images in the first place, cover a little technical background from a non-technical person, just to break it down, and then really deep dive into the core issues. Then I'll be talking about content moderation. A lot of you may know that term, but more so from like a platform space. It's very different thinking about content moderation from companies that are creating image detectors versus a Twitter or a Facebook or whatever. So I think it's really important to cover this category given that it's unique. Then I'll be talking about the pros and cons of open sourcing. Many of you may work in the AI community. You know, open sourcing is a hot topic. Everyone has their opinion. I'm just here to lay out the pros and cons, but for this particular issue, I think it's particularly fascinating. And then lastly, we'll touch on some solutions that I think really define the space. Great, okay, synthetic images, how are they created? Many of you may be familiar with GANs or generative adversarial networks. That kind of used to be the original way that synthetic images were created. They're less popular now, mostly due to their performance not really matching up in the same way as image diffusion models. Image diffusion models are kind of the normative image generation in this day. You've probably heard of Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, DALL-E, of course, and the underlying factor in all of these models is image diffusion. And the way that it works is that it's combined with text-to-image guidance to generate images, and there's an entire denoising process. So the models take training data, they add noise to them, and then they recover the data by reversing the noise. The way that it works is that in the reverse process, the neural network recovers the original data, and all this is guided by the original caption. So given the labels that the original training data had, and then the synthetic image in the end will be guided by those same labels. However, you will get a completely new image. You won't get a boilerplate copy of the exact training data that it was based off of. Very simple explanation, but I think important to understand what we're talking about. So most of the presentation will be about trust and safety and thinking about this from a policy risk perspective, given that that's what I specialize in. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about images in particular recently, given the vast variety of the models that exist right now. So I'd like to frame this with this core question, which is how can you make the product as safe as possible without limiting creativity and performance? I think that this is probably the hardest question to answer, and it's something that I think about on a daily basis, given that model performance is not exactly equated to model safety. And I think that's like one of the core tenets of what makes this work so difficult and rewarding. For example, if you have your standard set of 2 million images in training data, but you find that your model is actually regurgitating like really harmful sexual images of women, and then you look at your training data and a lot of the images in your training data are just sexual images of women. Well, great, you could decide to remove all the sexual images of women, but when you try to run the model, maybe your model performance sucks at generating women because it doesn't have that much data about women anymore. So that's a really simple example, but just to illustrate that it's a lot harder than it seems to really balance safety with performance. And so that's something we need to keep in mind. Content moderation. So like I said before, we've heard this term in several different contexts. I'll talk about it more specifically with synthetic images and the generation process as a user to generate a synthetic image. The first thing I want to talk about is keywords and keyword detection. There are a lot of different kinds of violative images that you can create on these tools, but the actual prompts that you use don't have to sound violative for the image to be violative. So what I mean by that, and I have my like ketchup and eggplant examples, which may seem like super weird, like what is she talking about? But ketchup is like a synonym for blood and eggplant is synonym for a phallic symbol. Like this is really weird, but like very present abuse that you're seeing in the space right now when people are trying to create sexual images of children, sexual images, non-consensual sexual imagery of women, and then they're figuring out ways to use different benign objects to introduce phallic context. Ketchup is like a similar thing, trying to generate really violent images without actually invoking the violence within the prompt. There's a little case study that I have here on Midjourney. Basically, I want to say like in February 2023, so relatively recently, Midjourney added a bunch of different like reproductive organs to its block list. So you couldn't generate mammary glands or fallopian tubes and all of that stuff because they were trying to limit sexual content being generated. That being said, a bunch of medical researchers couldn't really create anatomical images that they needed for their work. So keyword detection is a band-aid solution. It's great to have, it's great to rely on, but it's never going to be perfect. Next, I want to kind of segue into the core TNS risks that I'll be talking about more in depth. I like to separate these into two categories: photorealism as a broad concept and adversarial abuse. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more in a second. And then the last thing I want to talk about broadly about trust and safety on this slide is acceleration and paradigm shifts. And so what I mean by this is you have the classic dual use dilemma problem, right? You have this amazing technology that can generate all these different things that artists can use to bolster their work, that people can use to generate their own like graphics that they've never been able to do before. At the same time, you also have a technology that can accelerate all sorts of risks depending on misuse, who your user is, and then broadly just being unable to decipher what is synthetic and what exists in the real. So what is reality, which I'll be talking about a bit more with photorealism. Prior to this job, I worked at LinkedIn and I worked on disinformation investigations and influence operations at scale. So this topic is pretty close to my heart and definitely something that I'll focus on. But information disorder is really important. And images can have a greater impact than words. So what I mean by that is the visceral impact of a particular image is like the way that it affects a human being from like a very basic standpoint is very different from words. And the trust established when someone looks at an image is also different, especially if that image looks like a photograph, which really brings in the photorealism perspective. I have this quote here from these two researchers that I think really sum it up super well. But my point here is that perception is reality in many of these cases, and this is a huge paradigm shift for the field that we really need to consider. Like I said before, there's acceleration on adversarial abuse. The last point that I'd like to cover on this slide is that it's really hard to control the dissemination of synthetic photoreal images on the internet. What do I mean by that? So basically, my point is that this is diffused and it's disjointed. So you have the company that is providing the service for the image generator itself. Then that image can travel on a platform, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, if it's used in a video. And then the control over where that image goes is entirely out of the hands of the company that helped generate the image, and then is in the hands of the company, the platform that has to now decide whether the images that have been spread on the platform itself are synthetic or not. But where that image goes and what people's perception of that image is completely out of the platform's hands too. So it's kind of a game changer, so to speak, when you're thinking about information disorder and disinformation. There's always going to be traditional disinfo campaigns using words, but it's just not fun to think about adversaries gaining access to more photoreal content to convince people to overturn democracies, etc. Which is the perfect segue to talk about adversarial abuse. So I talked a little bit about disinfo. I really want to focus on the other two categories on this slide. First, to start off, synthetic non-consensual exploitative images. I took this term from Twitch, which recently released their content policies about NCEI content, which I thought were pretty robust. And I really like this way of explaining what this is. There has been issues about revenge porn, face swap apps, CSAM, which for those who are unfamiliar, child sexual abuse material that have just greatly accelerated because of synthetic imagery. The ability to take a real person's photo and then completely change their body in that photo, to undress them, to take images of children and exploit those images in sexual non-consensual manners, which sounds like it's the most egregious thing anyone can do, but it is happening in this space. And this form of sexualization is incredibly concerning, given the comment and the point that I made earlier. It's hard to track the diffusion of these images and regulate in general. So I would say NCEI and sexual content in general, to me, is my biggest personal concern, given how much it affects user privacy and the ability for it to affect an individual's life, I think is immense. And then the other thing I want to talk about is extremist propaganda. So it's better than Photoshop. So what I mean when I say that is that you have your traditional extremist groups, networks, ISIS, Patriot Front, 3%ers, Proud Boys, what have you. And they love their graphics, they love their propaganda, they love holding their guns, etc. But the ability for them to generate content like that has generally been pretty low bar, not super great. Probably some dude on Photoshop trying to generate these images. Right now, they have a lot more opportunity. And I'm about to show you some examples as well of some of the images that they're generating in their channels. But point to say is that we are streamlining the ability for anyone to use this technology, which also means extremist or dangerous individuals. And they can use it to support their goals, because one, there isn't a lot of moderation in the open source, and two, we go back to diffusion. It's really hard to control the dissemination of these images. The second thing I'll say is fine-tuning and iteration. So there's some models where even if there's safeguards in the open source model, there's enough tooling and fine-tuning available where you can really get the model to do exactly what you want, whether that's training the model on a very specific set of images so the result is going to be similar to those images, or iteration, being able to use a model that allows you to reiterate on that same piece of content and same image, and using prompt engineering to generate images that really fit what you're looking for your use case. as great as this can be in any sort of benign way, for extremist propaganda, it's not so great, and it's definitely a concern in the space. So here's some examples that I did myself for fun for this presentation. So you'll see to the left, war zone in Ukraine, drones flying overhead, 35mm photograph. So this was created using Midjourney. Not all of these photos look super photoreal, but there's a couple where if I decided to shrink the image enough and I posted it somewhere, someone somewhere might believe it. The other image you can tell is a little less photoreal, given just kind of like the way the fire and the smoke look, but I figured it's important to show kind of like the variety of how these images can look, and they're only getting better over time. Here's some more examples. I basically picked like disinfo campaigns that I could think of off the top of my head, which is why I picked divisive topics. So Palestinian protests in the West Bank. You can tell like there's the image at the bottom where that boy's face is kind of disjointed. So that's clearly not super photoreal. But if employed at a certain angle with enough negative prompting where if I decided to fine tune the image away from showing faces and just to show the background, could easily be used. And this doesn't have to be photoreal to be dangerous, right? Anyone could use this as propaganda. Anyone could use this to bolster their claims about Uyghurs being happy in Xinjiang when all of us know that that's not true and they're being heavily repressed by the CCP. But they're smiling in this photo, so, you know. Anyways, you all must be feeling pretty down. I'll say one more thing that might make you feel worse, and then we can move back to the presentation. But here's this other service called Gabby AI. Some of you may know about Gab, which is a right-wing social network that several different communities really enjoy engaging with. They're very anti-content moderation and very pro-free speech, or what they think is free speech. But this is actually being actively used by extremist networks in order to generate images. What I mean by that is Gabby AI is Gab's own AI generator surface that they have created that does not have any content moderation. And so you can see on the other side, I pulled a post by this guy, I won't say his name, I probably should have removed his name, but here he said post-rapture chaos. The concept of post-rapture is like a far-right concept rooted in like Christian nationalism and white supremacy, but he was able to generate some really cool images to support that concept. So should we be worried? Yes. Are all of these images perfect? No, definitely not. And I think it's important to separate the real from the hype, but I can certainly believe that they're being used for propaganda, even if they're not being used to convince people that they're real images. Great. Okay, so slightly less heavy topic, open sourcing. So open sourcing, as you know, is kind of a key debate in the AI community right now, right? So like how much of our model do we want to open source? Like, is openness positive for society? And there's lots of questions around that. I think there's lots of different answers and positions that one could take, but I really wanted to focus on open sourcing in the case of synthetic imagery and kind of talk through some of the positives and negatives. So to start off with the positives, you can get a lot of increased creativity and use cases with fine tuning. So what I mean by that is like, if people use open source models, but they decide to fine tune, for example, they are really into fashion and they want to fine tune that model only on pictures from like the Louis Vuitton runway. Great, then the model will be really good at generating designs similar to what Louis Vuitton does. Similar cases like that where you can get really interesting, fun use cases with the model. There's also developer improvements in building on the model, right? Two heads are better than one kind of thing. You have several people engaging in the AI community with the model and doing all sorts of things with it and figuring out ways to improve the model, which is a positive. Kind of goes in hand with broader, wider access to the core model. And then the last thing is if the model is open source, And there's the other caveat that I will say is I'm talking about open source a lot in general. I know that there's like different things that you can open source, like parameters versus training data versus model weights, but we'll just discuss it generally for the purpose of this presentation. But the last aspect that could be a positive is for audits. So audits done by the wider community, audits that aren't controlled by just the one entity that owns the AI, and greater transparency there as well. Great. Okay. So here's some negatives that I've thought a lot about. Fine-tuning for fun can also mean fine-tuning for bad. So fine-tuning on practically any suite of images. This has happened in the past. I don't know if you all are familiar with unstable diffusion, which is the service that has used stable diffusion and fine-tuned it on a bunch of sexual images of mostly women, to be honest, and used it as its own kind of porn site. I don't think that's particularly great for all the images of women that it may or may not be using. Minimal moderation at the model level. It's really hard to moderate something that is open source, even if parts of it are open source, and it's hard to hard code moderation at the model level. There's adversarial aspects that could get through to the model, that could fine tune the model on a bunch of bad stuff like I just talked about. So the moderation is probably not going to be robust. You're unable to monitor adversarial content as a whole. If the model is open source, then who is monitoring the model? Nobody really. Maybe some like really active ethicists in the space, but I think it'll be really hard to track that as a whole. And then lastly, which is probably one of my favorite points from this presentation that I just keep on saying, is diffused effects, right? Like how do the effects of the model diffuse and how much control are you able to have over it? This, I think, is a common issue with synthetic images, period. But I do think it gets exacerbated by open source models, given so many people doing so many different things with the model. It's really hard to track when you're going to get your next unstable diffusion lurking around the corner. And the company that created the model is probably not going to consider itself liable for it. So it's important to talk about. Great. Okay. So lastly, ending on a brighter note, solutions and moving forward. So some of the aspects on here are a little bit more technical that I've gained after just reading a bunch of research in the space. But to start off, there's some challenges with deepfake detection right now through binary classification. So what I mean by that is like traditional deepfake detection through binary classification is really dependent on having like very robust data of fake faces versus real faces. That's kind of hard to execute. And then at that point, it's really like you're pigeonholing yourself to that data. So it's really hard to do that like outside of faces, like for all sorts of images to detect what is fake and what is real through binary classification. So that's not super ideal. What I think can be done is thinking about like, how do we clean training data sets? So what I mean by that is like really starting from the source. So rather than thinking about like, oh, like what are all the things that we can add on the block list, which block list is great, but when you're thinking about mitigations for a model, like all the mitigations shouldn't be at the end point where the model is about to hit the user. We should try to focus on making the mitigations baked into raw models. And that's where I think that the future of this field is really going. So how do you imbue safety from the start? How do we ensure that data sets don't have harmful images of children or really bad stuff from 4chan that we wouldn't want the model to emit, like pictures of swastikas, like all of that really simple. It sounds very basic, but you would be surprised. But I think that's really important, right? I think the basic stuff is important. And then the third thing, embedding metadata in digital watermarks. I find this to be particularly interesting. What I mean by metadata and watermarks is basically like embedding this within the model itself and within like the generated images. So like having hidden metadata about model information, what type of training data was used, what were the specific parameters used, which is, I think, super fascinating and could be really helpful in the space. One important trade-off here is performance versus explainability. So given that you're adding all this metadata into the model, there's a chance that the performance in and of itself on those images won't be as great as it would be without this metadata. So obviously, it's like what I talked about before, that balance that you have to maintain between safety and performance. And then the last bullet is probably the bullet that I feel the closest to, which is how do we navigate this cultural, societal, political paradigm shift with synthetic images, right? Number one thing that I think is difficult, but is the clearest next step to do is imposing costs on bad actors, particularly people that are generating and disseminating NCEI. Like, those people need to be punished. It's already illegal to have images of children that are inappropriate. So I think it's really important for like legislators, lawmakers to think about the synthetic aspect to this issue of non-consensual imagery and really try to develop costs for bad actors that may disseminate these images. The second thing is increasing media literacy about synthetic images. We're a bunch of smart people in this room, but I can guarantee you, if you like put like 3 people in line, like apart from us that we may know, your aunt or your cousin or your cousin's aunt or whatever, like they're not going to know about synthetic images or AI in the same way that we do. And people probably aren't thinking about the ethical ramifications of this on a daily basis. And so I think, as basic as it sounds, increasing media literacy about this is super important. And I mean that from a very rudimentary level. I think there's going to be a time in society when like children in schools are going to be learning about synthetic images as a part of their curriculum. And so I think like accepting that reality and really forging forward with that through education is important. And then lastly, just thinking about cross-functional partnerships, which also seems simple, but like Rachel mentioned before, like thinking about all the different players in the space and how we can do regulation is really hard, but the conversations definitely have to start. And everybody in the space has different interests, different goals between industry, civil society, and policymakers. But I think like trying to get through the low-hanging fruit or the stuff that everyone can agree on being bad. One example, like synthetic child sexual abuse material and NCEI, to me is the perfect first step. And then perhaps all of the more complex stuff that maybe there may be more disagreements on, we can spend more time on. But I think that there's some like core issues and some pretty obvious levels of like harm with that kind of content that I think there needs to be robust discussion between cross-functional partners. With that, I am done with my presentation. I don't know if I have time for questions, but yeah, thank you.
Had several comments.
Oh,
Chat,
great.
Were pretty funny.
Funny comments.
Yes. So you can take a look here. So people think that the images were not realistic. And so that this
Oh, I
one
see
here.
it.
So these are the top comments that we have. First one from Arash and then another from Ken.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, but that's it. Let me see if we have, we have a question.
Sure.
So from a policy perspective, what do you think about sharing data of abusive creators with other companies the same way some other indicators of compromise are already being shared, like IPs, email addresses, etc.?
Yeah, totally. I think that like in general, every company in the space that possesses an image generation product should be thinking about that. Like traditionally with like investigations in the space, I think there's been a great paradigm shift in what bad actors are using and their tactics changing. And I honestly think that like the reason perhaps that there hasn't been enough information sharing is just that like the companies in the space are getting their bearings with just dealing with this content at scale. But as these companies mature, I'm pretty confident that there'll be more of a robust investigative approach in the future. I could even see a future where specific harmful synthetic images are hashed and shared in a database with several other companies. And that's a future that I would like to see. I just think that we're like, by we, I think the space is like quite nascent, and the diffusion effects of this content certainly don't help either. So like tracking the images themselves require like robust industry partnerships that perhaps aren't fully baked yet.
Thank you, Bilva. Do we have any other questions, guys? If not, I suggest that we could probably do the cozy panel discussion right now. What do you think? Do you feel like you need a break, or if not, we can just jump into the discussion and then we can maybe have some drinks and talk. This is our first event in DC. It's our new location. So today we're kind of in this very cozy atmosphere, not too many people. So I think that would be fine if we just go directly to the panel discussion. If it's okay, let's just do it. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. So let me introduce guys, come on here. Let me introduce thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Our moderator for the panel discussion, Rosmi, maybe you could, or maybe, yeah, you can.
Or do you want to
sit
be in
here.
between us?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me double check that you all are in the.
Just turn it this way a little bit.
Oh, people are saying thank you, Bilva. People from online, like the people
Thank you.
who were
Back to
joining
them.
virtually. They love the presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is a little weird. Who are
I know
these
where I'm
people? Okay, so cool. So yeah, we kind of both had a set.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of it.
Okay, it's a single purpose thing that focus on just
Can I
this
use
thing.
that? I look, there's some glare.
Yeah, so well, welcome back from the supposed break that didn't happen, but so we have, I mean, amazing panel here to discuss, to basically just untangle a bit more of responsible AI, why is sort of important now. So Rosmi from, I have the customer success organization at Toloka with me, I mean, you know, Bilva, and then we also have Divyans from the Federation of American Scientists. So he's the associate director for emerging technologies and national security. So I think we'll have quite a dynamic discussion, and yeah, we'll talk to the audience for sure as well. Not just get started, right? So I mean, we don't have a lot of people, but people from Zoom, you're free to react as well. So here's a simple cue. If you think responsible AI is sort of important now, can give a clap, or you can do some emoji. So yeah,
It would be awkward if no one clapped.
everybody sort of think it's important right now, right? So let me ask a bit more about that question to the panel here as to why is the momentum now? I mean, Rachel mentioned in the first part of discussion that, hey, this is the first time that we have human as a decision maker, right? But it's not applied to everything. For some of the things, I'll go to you first, Bilva. Things like synthetic images, they're not necessarily new, right? People have been using Photoshop forever. You can create, it's difficult probably to come up with videos, but why is the moment sort of now that is very important?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So to start off, like speaking about synthetic images in particular, I do agree with the standpoint that like people have been manipulating images forever. I mean, even deep fakes themselves, like the Tom Cruise deep fake that everyone knows about, that people saw like a year or two ago. But in terms of why it's really gaining traction now, I think there's been like a realization of access and opportunity from these technologies. Like you are seeing like artists and creators that actually rely on image generation and image generation techniques to further their work. You're seeing people who are graphic designers that are using this at scale, and you're seeing a widespread adoption in a way that's completely new. I'll also say like Photoshop, I don't know if that's like equivalent to the way that we see image generation tools, given like I don't think there's that same ease of access. I can say for sure that I don't have a Photoshop account and have never thought about getting one, but I sure as hell have a DALL-E account. I mean, that's kind of a cop out because I work there, but you get what I mean, right? Like it's very different in terms of access, and anyone can truly use the technology
Mm.
and get good at it. And I think that presents a lot of opportunity. That leaves lots of room for abuse, of course, like I talked about in my presentation. But yeah, I think the technology has been democratized more and more adopted into the public consciousness.
I think that makes perfect sense. It's really the scale of the access. Now, from I guess a more scientist perspective, to be honest, what do you think of the momentum right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be unfair to characterize that the moment is now, because the moment has been with us for a while. In fact,
Right.
like, people have been talking about this for decades, not necessarily widely known that people have been talking about it. But I guess maybe the moment is now in Washington. But people have been talking about this. People have been working on interpretability, explainability, like all the key tenets you lay out. People have been working on this right now. Now the question comes to this is a great point that was raised. Like, you've reduced the cost of access.
Mm.
You've lowered the barrier to entry, right? You want to do Photoshop, you need to learn so much. Like, I never bothered to learn Photoshop because it was just a lot of onboarding. Whereas for DALL-E, what do you need to do? Just like know how to write a sentence that makes sense, right? Or try different sentences. The third thing is the scale, right? These were conversations we had when we went from oral form of communication to written form of communication, from written form of communication to print, from print to generative AI. Like, we've had these conversations ever since, we've been communicating. It's about like the conversation changes when a new technology comes, and it's at a scale that we've not seen before. The other thing that people are recognizing is the harms that we've seen with other technologies, where the idea around standards and responsibility has been like an afterthought, right? Instead, building those principles into the technology as the core tenets, rather than something that you think after you've reached peak capability. I think like that's a shift in mindset and how we are developing the technologies in our research labs, in our in the industry and academia, wherever you look at it.
Right. Can I dig a bit more there, to be honest, what you mentioned, right? I mean, Bilva outlined a lot of bad things that can happen with, using AI not so responsibly. What else do you think could be out there, or what have you seen in your field of work?
Okay. So there were Bilva mentioned that these technologies could be used for propaganda. I'll tell you, they have been used for propaganda. If you look at the intelligence threats assessment report that comes out every year from the Director of National Intelligence, like we know the Chinese Communist Party has been using machine learning tools to promote, to create spam accounts at scale, and like just like spreading misinformation, especially around the treatment of Uyghurs. Right. And other human rights abuses that happen in the PRC. The second thing, another thing that happened last year or 2 years ago, something like that, like they trained a CAN to like essentially get around cybersecurity infrastructure at a US nuclear power plant.
Wow.
And plant a malware in the code for that power plant's operations. So things have been happening. And the other thing, like slightly less scary, but also like very harmful, when Stable Diffusion was released publicly, there was a huge upscale, as was mentioned, around child pornography. It prompted a lot of members of Congress to start writing letters about it, which like we can dive into, but
and that is an illegal activity under the law right now.
Mhm.
You cannot distribute images that even resemble child pornography. Like they don't have to be real images of child pornography. The law specifically says any like distribution or reception of even images or videos that resemble child pornography, that is also prosecutable.
Right, so in those circumstances, right, I mean, so let me ask this question on who should be held accountable, or what should be our approach in such a situation? Do we pull in, things that we've been applying in other fields, such as for information, personal PII, I think in GDPR is mainly like each company will have to appoint a C-suite person who's responsible if something bad happens. Now, Bilva, probably you might be the best person to start with here in terms of like this type of content. Is it the end user? Is it the platform that distributes this? Is it the algorithm? Is it like data scientists or product managers? Like some of us here are like, if you write something, you need to be careful about how it's going to be used.
Yeah, this is a challenging question for sure. And I think that it's important to kind of understand like accountability from different lenses. There's one where the model itself creates all of this harmful content. And then there's two, like users are tampering with the model, users are fine-tuning open source models, the users that create the really bad content on purpose versus the model that may inadvertently, accidentally create bad content, not on purpose. So I think that's important to like anchor the discussion. And then the other thing that I'll say is like, I think in the space, there are some like basic things that can be done. So if any of you are familiar, like the National Center, the NCMEC, which is, I'm now forgetting the like exact parts of the acronym for exploited children, basically. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. Where all tech companies, all like major social media platforms report content, child sexual abuse material, like this standard has existed for quite a while. I think it's like time for like people, individuals, or I should say companies in the industry that create image generators or like have any sort of like AI tool to be able to do so, to be held accountable to report those images. Some companies likely do so voluntarily, but I think that's kind of like where the paradigm shift is happening. Like, how do we take the tools that we already have, which kind of goes back to what Rachel was talking about. I don't think we entirely need to reinvent the wheel, but I do think that there needs to be like increased attention on niche forms of abuse, and there needs to be like some sort of like alignment to like what the current problems look like. And there's learning that we can get from the past, like from NCMEC, like they're the experts on child sexual abuse material if we're talking about that. But I think broadly, there's lots of stuff that can be done. And I do think some of that responsibility is on the end user. Like if you're a user that's trying to create that content, you should absolutely be punished for it. But I also think there's a responsibility on all the companies in the space, right? Like, what does your training data look like? Like, why is your model creating this by itself? And that's kind of where like regulatory questions come into hand. And that's where the problems I was talking about before between open sourcing and not open sourcing get more complicated. Because I think that's a harder question to answer. And I don't even have the answer for this as to like companies that do fully open source their models or open source most of their models. How will they be held accountable for an open source model being fine-tuned on harmful data? Don't have the answer for you there. I'm not a policymaker, but that's something that policymakers should be thinking about. So I think there's like lots of different actors in the chain, perhaps each responsible for different parts of the process. But I don't think all of the onus of this should go on just industry or just policymakers to figure out, or just bad users that are creating like child pornography. It really like, it needs to be a leveled approach based on like the power that each individual actor has along that chain.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Now that we have audience here, so any of you wants to sort of add more perspective into that sort of direction, or maybe ask a question at this moment to the panel?
And a comment.
Right.
In the Zoom chat.
Yes, I can read that out.
There it is, yeah.
There's also the hardware aspect. So the progress that companies like NVIDIA made in the past few years has been very significant, to say the least. So theory finally met hardware. Thanks for the comment there. I think that makes sense, that it's probably part of the ecosystem that we should consider, right? In terms of just responsibility.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that because it's an important conversation that we've been having around hardware, especially in the national security context, right? So the Biden administration imposed export controls on like it banned the export of high-end semiconductor chips, GPUs, to China. Primarily, why? Because they were it wasn't that it was, oh, we want to cripple their AI advantage. Well, probably that was definitely a side effect of what happened. But the original intent was US companies were manufacturing this hardware and then selling it, and it was being used in human rights abuses and creating social surveillance systems and often being used back to on attacks on US infrastructure. And so hardware has been a critical component of the conversation, especially since the export controls went into place. I think more and more people are starting to think about it. Now the Dutch and the South Koreans have joined the US in export controls on high-end semiconductor chips. So I anticipate this conversation is only going to grow.
Right, that makes sense. Now let me throw in another, I guess, direction of question here. Now, when it comes to ethics, right, all this things, I think it can be sort of depends on the region where culture might differ a little bit. Do you think it'll be ever possible to sort of establish a global standard to, hey, what is responsible AI? We can get to Bilva on that.
Ooh, this is a hard question. I don't know if it entirely fits within my expertise, but I'll answer to the best that I can. I think it's a good question. What my mind naturally gravitates to, just because I come from a trust and safety perspective, is like social media platforms, policymaking on a global scale. And coming from my experience at LinkedIn and just like thinking through that space a lot, applying policies in a global context is never going to be perfect. But to localize those policies for every single context globally is even harder. And so I'll start off the discussion with that. And then the other thing that I'll say is, like, unfortunately, the way that we're seeing AI adoption, much like the rest of global progress, it's not being done equally, right? Like Western countries still have greater access to this technology. There's higher levels of adoption, higher levels of like literacy with this technology. And though there is global adoption that's increasing, which personally makes me very excited, I wouldn't say that every single country is on the same like level playing field. And what worries me is that when we're moving closer and closer to advanced versions of this technology, or like general levels of intelligence, like how do we ensure that when we get to that state, it's truly built for all, not just built for the people that create it and the countries that they reside in. And so I think that's like a really important question to anchor the discussion. Whether we'll ever have responsible AI on a global scale, I almost think of that to be rhetorical, but I think that like there are tiny steps that we can do to get there. Like from a really baseline level, I know I've been talking a lot about images, right? But like thinking about like, oh, like if there's like text tools, like how do we make sure these tools are well equipped to answer questions at the same level of accuracy in Swahili than in English? Like that kind of granularity is needed to truly build equity with all of these products. It's not going to be easy. But I think some of those conversations in this community have been happening. And I think it's like very simple to state, but like we just need to get more people that look like the world in on the conversations in order to make it as equitable as possible. And there has to be widespread adoption and really like rejuvenating different parts of the globe with this technology and giving them access and the tools to use it, I think will be like exponentially important.
Right. What's more, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, see, the world, there's no one value system that people agree with. You know, if there was that, there used to be a time when the value system was, if you have a McDonald's, then probably you all agree with each other. But now Russia has or used to have McDonald's. Ukraine has McDonald's. I'm sure that didn't work out the way we thought. But there are like definitely like people think of things, you know, and that they aspire to, right? Like they may be grounded in regional and local contexts, I think, but it's a matter of how we take incremental steps to get there, right? The US has certain values, European nations have certain values, Asian countries have certain different values. And so like, how do we bring everyone together? We've done it before. It's not like, and that was my question previously, like, you know, we don't have to get to a level of granularity where we start imposing our system on everyone else, but like laying out those overarching objectives that we want to see, you know, and some of those may sound like platitudes, of like saying, oh, we should have more transparency, more accountability, fairness, etc. Like all these things. And then let the people figure it out what it means to them, right? Sure, there will be an aspirational goal for us. Oh, maybe we want other countries to get to a higher standard of this. We can work on that later on. Like, I think the first step is to get people to agree to the lowest common denominator, and then you work upward from there. The other thing on this, I see it as it from a contracts viewpoint as well, right? Like, where does the liability lie? Where does where, you know, do we get responsibility? I think it's on the product developer who's selling it to write up a contract for the end user, that the end user understands what they're buying, what's the system expected to do, so that if they are in breach of contract, say if the terms and conditions still say that you cannot generate so and so images or so and so whatever, then if you do so, then you're in breach of contract. And now you know, we should be able to shut your access off. As for regulation, I think we end up thinking of regulating first, asking questions later. That's the approach that the EU has been taking. In particular, I think we need to be very mindful there, because the EU was very hasty in GDPR and it just spoiled the internet. But the FTC came out with a very broad, very overarching recommendation yesterday. I still have to digest it fully, but like they say, if you sell a system that's intended to, or that can be used to deceive other people, even if that's not the purpose of the system, but it ends up doing so, you may be in violation of the FTC Act. Now, I don't know, like, if I agree with that, but I think people are thinking about it. It's just a matter of like what happened. I don't think Congress is going to do anything. I don't think the executive branch will have the time to do much either, especially after the NIST IRMF. I think we'll get somewhere with the industry. Industry will have to come up with a standard, as it has previously, and every technology industry has come up with standards. The government has looked at them. The government has, given a seal of approval, helped improve them, or told they don't make sense. And the other thing I would say is like there's been a lot of effort. So for instance, the US EU joint risk management framework is supposed to come out in the next couple of months, I think. But NIST has been working with EU on like how can we have responsible use of AI in certain technologies, healthcare, etc., financial services. I think that will get more and more important. Like it will have to be like multiple countries will have to come together, identify like what do they agree on, go from there. I think that's the only way. And they've done it before. It's not like we're telling them to do something new. It's a different technology at a different scale. I think they can rise to the challenge.
Thanks for the more positive tone there that we've done it before and
Always.
we can do it again. Now let me try one more time to open, I guess, the floor for questions, comments.
Yeah, we have some comments from the.
I'll read
I
out.
think there's a question over there.
Oh, there's a question. Let's do a question.
Sure. So there are tools out there today that we went over that can be deployed to interfere with or otherwise influence the 2023 and 2024 elections.
Oh yeah.
Just to bring it back domestic for a second. What should people in that space be paying attention to if they want to make sure that discourse that's going on is at least accurate for reality?
Then interesting question.
Can we, repeat the question just? In
Oh, yeah.
case, yeah. someone-
So in case for those in Zoom, so the question is related to tools that might interfere with the upcoming elections, and what should the people in the space be mindful of in that period?
There's a big conversation going on in DC right now on the biggest tool that could end up interfering in the election. Supposedly, think of this hypothetical. If you give editorial control of CNN to a foreign country, would that be acceptable? Like if that country now starts promoting certain programs that favor one candidate versus another, like one candidate that country supports or whatever, right? And that's a big conversation going on in DC right now around TikTok, right? Because they've been caught spying on US citizens. They've admitted to spying on US citizens in EU. They deny it in the US. The editorial content lies with the Chinese Communist Party that has been like the whole algorithmic control, data control, everything lies there. So that conversation is happening right now. Like the other side of it is on the disinformation side on social media networks, right? The government is very like they have their hands tied by the First Amendment. They can't they can't prevent people from posting on social media websites, but the social media companies can do, right? And so I think there's going to be a greater emphasis on having social media companies better monitor and better filter content. There's NSC is actually looking at like how to counter disinformation right now as it relates to the war. Right? If some disinformation campaign starts, their first thing is like get the right information out right away to counter it and like get it out to every place you can. I think that will be the way that we will end up seeing things like maybe some disinformation campaign starts and people will start flooding the waves with actual information. But one of my favorite contents on Twitter these days is like this weird Dali Generations account that has been posting presidents playing video games. So Trump, Obama, and Biden, all three of them playing video games together. Like It's amazing. Like, you should watch it.
What's your thoughts here, Bilva? Do you think there's any special, I don't know, moderation we need to put in place with regards to, political content, and is it even possible to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'd probably start off the conversation with like making sure that there isn't excess threat inflation about these issues. And so what I mean by that is like the concept of like disinformation, misinformation, etc., has existed in the psyche for quite a while, like desinformatia, Russians, Cold War, blah, blah, blah. But of course, like the nature of it now is different given access to the
scale.
internet. Yeah, of course. But I think it's really important to emphasize that like these networks, when we're trying to find these accounts, like one fundamental thing for the most part is the same, like they're fake coordinated networks. And the reason that I said that is because that actually gives me like, I'm more positive about detection in that, like when you're seeing a swarm of networks and coordinated behavior online by fake accounts, like the ability to at least detect that those accounts are fake has already been established in the space, and like Meta is well equipped to do so. Twitter, I don't know anymore, but the other companies in this space are pretty ready to attack this problem. What I will say is that there's probably going to be some more acceleration in terms of tactics and how these actors evolve. Does that mean that they're going to do more bad stuff? Or does that mean that their bad stuff is going to be more sophisticated? I would probably argue closer to the latter. I'll give you one example. Spamouflage Dragon is a known Chinese affiliated IO network called Spamflash because they just post a shit ton of spam. A lot of it is like mixed English and Mandarin characters, so you can tell this person does not live in Bethesda, but in fact is potentially a fake account. But I think a lot of these tools will empower sloppy actors to be better, whether that's through translation tools, like now they can speak perfect English, or like their ability to cater to target audiences. There's like information manipulation that's occurring on a global scale, but it's really hard for like Russian IO actors to appeal to like Ghanaians in a very particular way. But I think they're going to be empowered by these technologies. Translation's the first thing I think of, but even just like write me like XYZ sentence about this issue in this language and cater it to a 15-year-old. Like that'll be so much easier, and you'll probably need less people in Albania behind really old computers in like a hot, sweaty room, and just maybe like less than half of them being empowered by these tools. So I think that they'll just get more sophisticated. Maybe they'll do more of it, but I think the sophistication is what I worry about, and detection as a result of increased sophistication is going to be hard. But going back to threat inflation, right? Like these social media companies know what fake accounts look like. Perhaps the way that they're posting stuff will look different because tactics will change. But I don't think that like suddenly like the space is immobilized to detect this content, because as actors evolve, the people that are detecting the actors will also evolve. But I am worried about a day where like you have really, really sophisticated fake accounts where even an IO expert won't be able to discern whether this person like works at a DC think tank or are they a Chinese influence actor, for example.
Right. And to that point, like there's another aspect to this where it's actually even happening right now where people would pose as IRS agents or someone from their country's embassy or something, and they would like email people. So like people would pose as IRS agents and email like elderly people, and then like essentially engage in a conversation to try and get them to like buy thousands of dollars in Apple gift cards in exchange for not prosecuting them for tax fraud that they've never committed. Are people who are like there's been the whole case around like people posing as embassy officials reaching out to international students from China and saying, oh, your family in China is in danger unless you pay us. So I think those actors will get more sophisticated. So it's only time before we see a Nigerian prince coming out of GPT-3.
Right, yeah, time for the comments. So, quite a few comments there. So White House OSTP released the AI Bill of Rights, which overlaps with the question of who is accountable. Also, the NIST risk management framework is a good start for transitioning AI from development to deployment. Thoughts
Right.
on this?
What?
To, I guess,
You go ahead. I have a lot of thoughts on the White House one.
I mean, I don't think from my perspective, I have much more to add there. Like I think that there are steps that are being taken to recognize the potential of this technology. I still think that there's like a skill gap in bringing those expectations to reality through regulation. And I think that there like sometimes is an oversimplification of the tech itself. That's like a little bit of what I worry about. I think the AI Bill of Rights is a good first step, and I don't know if I'm the most qualified to talk about that specifically, but I think there's like a lot of nuance within the tech itself that we talked about earlier, right? Like who is accountable? Like, I think maybe policymakers are very quick to jump to the fact that like industry is 100% accountable. Not that industry shouldn't be accountable, but I think that like within sub issues, within specific kinds of tech, like open source versus not open source, X model versus Y model, something being fine-tuned to do bad stuff versus like the original model being fine. Like there's so much more nuance into the actual technology itself and also user behavior on the technology, where like I don't think that complexity is being perhaps grasped like widely with policymakers, but yeah.
Okay,
On that, sorry, Divans, before you jump in there, also on accountability, there's another comment related to what Bilva just mentioned, that perhaps generative AI companies themselves should roll out tools to detect AI generated content and or embed immutable stamps into it to facilitate identification and tracking, if such stamps are possible at all, of course. So this, I think, supports your thought there on how perhaps the industry should play a key role, but I guess your thought was more on it's not just the industry, but thought is really here that industry players themselves can do it as well. So yeah, to your thought too.
so I'll start off with that comment first. I think like that's a good idea that I believe a lot of people in the industry have been toying with right now. But that's not going to stop state actors from training their own models. Like, you know, if a malicious state actor wants to engage in massive disinformation campaign or like whatever, like they're going to train a model without those steps. They can train their own models. They have massive resources. The second thing on the NIST AI RMF is amazing. Like it's a product of months of consultation that NIST led with industry, academia, nonprofits, civil rights groups, everyone. Like NIST went above and beyond in ensuring that RMF reflected the consensus of the community. The White House blueprint, first, it's a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. It's not an AI Bill of Rights. And it irks me when even people from the White House call it an AI Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights doesn't say you should have a free press or you should have the right to a jury of your peers. No. So what the White House laid out is a blueprint to coming to a Bill of Rights. It's a right now, no offense to the hard work that went in there. Right now, it's still just a bunch of platitudes. And we need to move from there to an actual grounded Bill of Rights that the White House, I believe, will work on now in collaboration with the industry, academia, and nonprofits, and all the other stakeholders that are out there. I do think it's important that we have a consensus-driven approach so that, you know, not everybody likes what's in the NIST ARMF, and that's all right. Like, you know, maybe Google does not like something, maybe, you know, some nonprofit doesn't like something else, and that But everybody agreed to that core set of principles that went in there. Everybody agrees to the RMF as a whole, and everybody is going to employ it. And that ensures stability. If a new administration comes in 2025, the NIST AI RMF isn't going anywhere. The blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, however, that's a different question.
Right, I think we will be wrapping the panel up. I mean,
Yeah.
we'll be talking more and more. Maybe one last question, comment here from the audience, or we're,
I have
right.
comment here, yeah.
I'll just read
Yeah.
that comment out loud, from Ken, a +1 that generative AI empowers abusers who are non-native speakers. Yeah. It makes
Thanks,
them
Ken.
native and convincing, yeah. So with that, I thank the panelists, Bilva and Divyans and all the participants and people on Zoom as well for the comments, thoughts. So yeah, thank you for being with us, and I think we'll continue being here and
Oh, yeah.
network and all that. Yeah.
Okay, here, and I have just one last slide. Yeah, thank you, Rosny.
Thank you.
Moderated this discussion, and thank you guys. It was an active and very interesting discussion, and we had really comments from the audience, questions. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. Thanks. All right.
Yeah. I have a couple of more slides. I would be really grateful, guys, if you give me some feedback on the event. You can just scan this QR code and then share your ideas and your opinion, what could be improved, what you liked or you didn't like about this event. Since it's our first event in DC, your feedback is very, very important to us. And also, thank you very much. If you have any questions, just reach out to me. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, or just here's my email address. And also, if you would like to participate in our future events virtually or in person, just let me know. We have events almost every month in different locations, and we have very interesting topics and speakers. So that would be great to keep in touch and see how we can collaborate in the future. So thank you again, and we still have some time. Feel free to grab some food or drinks, and I'll be here for another 15 minutes or half an hour. Just if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and talk with me. All right, thank you.